We've been exploring every options the Seahawks have at quarterback in 2023. Bump, we've talked plenty about Geno Smith. We talked the other day about Mel Kiper's prediction that Will Levis, Kentucky quarterback, actually lands in Seattle at number 5 overall. You were not a huge fan of that one. But that's not what we're talking about today. What we're talking about today is another option that may be right under their nose the whole time. What about Drew Lock? You know, Bump, I've written it off, if only because I think that, you know, Geno did so well for them and deserves his money and can be really successful for them. But the Seahawks do have another option, and it is important that we explore it. Drew Lock, the other quarterback here in Seattle, back up behind Geno, part of the Russell Wilson trade. He is an unrestricted free agent, though one would assume the Seahawks will be happy to bring him back, and it will be significantly less costly than Geno.
Are you guys ready for this? We're going to advocate for Drew Lock.
We're ready.
We've done a lot for Geno Smith, why you should pay him, what you should do in the draft, maybe get a quarterback late. But Drew Lock is on the sideline like, what about me? Mm-hmm. And it's a real possibility. And the reason why we think this is a real possibility is because we hear the way Schneider and Pete Carroll talk about Drew Lock. If Geno are to go out there and get an offer from a football club that the Hawks feel like they can't match or won't match, you got to start looking at Drew Lock. So let's take a trip down memory lane with Drew Lock. Last year, I sat down with Shane Waldron, and we watched about 30 to 45 minutes of film on Drew. And we're breaking down the film, and obviously we're looking at mostly his highlights, not his lowlights. We're trying to highlight the kid and see what he can do. I believe if you go to the Seahawks YouTube, the film session is still up to this day. And the thing that we both liked about Drew Lock is that he has the arm strength to make every single throw out there. His rookie year, he goes 4-1 in 5 games. He throws 7 touchdowns and 4 interceptions. He beats the Houston Texans, throws for 300 yards against them. He beats the Chargers, Detroit, and Oakland. Now, you could say not an impressive win, right? But I'm saying this is the NFL. You'll take any win. So Hawks lost to the whole NFC South this year. So don't tell me
we don't need to talk about it.
That wins aren't important. You take that. Then in 2020, he goes 3 for 13. 3 and 13, 16 touchdowns, 15 interceptions. This is like his real first full year. And I look at those stats and I go, I remember a guy named Peyton Manning having a real bad first year. All right. And Drew Lock in his 3 years over there with the Denver Broncos, he had 2 different offensive coordinators as well. After that 3 and 13 year, they bring in Teddy Bridgewater to compete with him. As a young quarterback, I'm not making excuses. I'm just telling you how it is. A young quarterback, you're drafted by this team. You put together a decent rookie season. You come back in a COVID year with a new offensive coordinator, and you struggle a bit, and then they give up on you so quickly. Vic Fangio says, you know what, now this guy ain't it. I'm bringing in Teddy Bridgewater to compete with him. That's not how you build a franchise. That's not how you develop a quarterback. Teddy Bridgewater wins that job. So now I'm looking at Drew Lock, and I'm trying to think about where he is mentally. Kind of familiar. Reminds me of Geno Smith a little bit. You've been given up on by a team that drafted you, and you're sent across the country to go back up another backup in Geno Smith. So maybe sitting a year or two has done something for Drew Lock. Physically, he can play in this league. I talked about different type of leadership with the quarterback position. If you were to throw Drew Lock in the mix of those 4 quarterbacks that I mentioned, a 5th way of leading. Drew Lock, he does his own thing, right? Another way of leading. So I say that to not really pump up Drew Lock and say he should be the guy, but to say he will and does deserve another chance in his league. And if Schneider and Pete Carroll are willing to roll the dice on him, they've earned the right to do that. They've earned my trust to where I'm like, okay, you did it with Geno Smith. I wasn't sure about it. Why not do it with Drew Lock? Yeah. So it's been rough for Drew. He's still young. He's really only had a year and a half, not even a year and a half, a year and 4 or 5 games to try to prove himself in this league. And we've seen that is just not enough. So we shall see. What are your thoughts on Mr. I put on for my city?
Well, I will tell you, I'm going to add a little additional context, too, to you going back in time with some Pete Carroll sound. That was Bump going back in time, taking a walk down memory lane for Drew's own history in Denver leading up to this moment. to add on to that, here's some of what Pete Carroll has had to say about Drew going back to Drew's time in Seattle. Let's start with October. This is Pete Carroll talking about not just preparing for Geno and supporting Geno, but also doing the same with Drew.
I've been filling him up for ever since he's been here, when the time comes, so that when finally the opportunity was there, it was easy to just transition to the support, and that's never been a factor really. So we've had a positive there. But for a guy who hasn't had that, and maybe Drew is a guy that hasn't had the kind of support that's going to bring out the best in him. We're yet to see that. I think you're going to see a fantastic player in him when his time comes and all that, because he's going to be in a different mentality approaching his work.
Now, a little while later in the season, Pete Carroll has asked, hey, why do you make it a point to bring up Drew Lock when you're answering questions about the quarterback position?
I think he's really good, and he's shown us that. He's an exciting, has an exciting future, and I many times have probably put it in the light that he's growing too, and he's going to be really good when he gets his chance. And we'll have just as many opportunities to make plays when he's on the field. We see it every day. I mean, he battles every day against our first defense, and competes to try to beat their tails every day. And it's great to see, and he's developing in ways that it just takes time. And so if he's fortunate enough to capture the time in similar fashion that Geno has, he's going to be a terrific player.
I personally think Pete Carroll chose Geno long before that decision was actually announced. Geno spent the vast majority of his time with the one team, Drew with the two team. But I don't think it's because Pete Carroll doesn't believe in Drew or think that Drew Lock can be good. I think he just felt, this is my interpretation of it, that Geno understood the playbook. Geno understood this offense, and Geno was more ready at that time than Drew was. But Pete Carroll isn't the only person who believes in Drew Lock. Take a listen to what Mark Schlereth had to say very recently, this with Wyman and Bob.
And I know one thing in Seattle, they feel pretty good about Drew Lock. You have to understand where Drew Lock comes from. I talked to a friend of mine that coached in the NFL that is still consulting in the NFL and really knows his stuff. And basically he evaluated Drew coming out of college, and he said, yeah, I don't know if Drew, like arm talent-wise and athleticism-wise, Drew can play. Drew's got good stuff. It's like it's the worst college offense I've ever seen. Like it does nothing to prepare you for the NFL. And so I think they feel pretty good about their quarterback situation, and that Drew Lock, with more seasoning and understanding of the game at the professional level, that Drew Lock will be, a solid player.
Now, I don't know what Drew Lock ends up being, but Bump, my opinion of Drew Lock compared to Geno lines up with some of the sentiment that Mark Schlereth explained earlier in his take here about the Seahawks liking Drew and the weapons that he has. I think that Geno was more of not just a pro-ready quarterback, but a quarterback who really understood Shane Waldron's offense, who really made good decisions, and who, importantly, Pete Carroll trusted. In fact, I have no idea if I'm right about this. Like, my gut feeling is that Pete Carroll trusted Geno more in 2022 than he did Russell Wilson at the end of Wilson's tenure. It's not because he didn't think Russell Wilson was exceptionally talented. It's not because he didn't like Russell Wilson. I think it's just because he felt like Geno gets it. Geno gets exactly what I want to do. He believes in what I want to do. And every decision that Geno is going to make is going to be made with this particular offense in mind. I wonder if the reason they went with Geno over Drew is because they didn't feel that Drew was there yet mentally. Drew's much younger. Drew has all the arm talent in the world. We saw Drew make, I would say, any fun throw that we saw in the preseason was probably from Drew and not necessarily Geno. I remember when Geno was announced as the starter, I thought, okay, makes sense. Like, we've kind of felt that this decision was coming since their press conference when Pete said that he would love to have Geno here, and Geno was not yet under contract. But I thought that it would be kind of a boring offense. I thought, wow, this is just going to be protect the ball, don't throw too far downfield, check down offense. Instead, Geno ended up being great with explosive plays. I mean, they weren't, the Eagles out here throwing 4 35-plus yard touchdowns. But the offense was much better than I thought it would be. I think that I don't know that I have all the faith in the world that Geno became who he was because Pete Carroll had the magic touch and he can do the exact same with Drew. I think they're different quarterbacks with different skill sets. Would I understand the Seahawks wanting to save themselves $20+ million, $25+ million, and go with a guy who they think can figure it out and take some of those mistakes because they recognize that they might take a step back or might struggle. Yeah, I can understand that sentiment. I am not convinced that Drew goes out there and looks like an all-pro.
Now, you shouldn't be convinced. We weren't convinced with Geno neither.
No, and I'm
looking back at the history of Pete Carroll. I'm not saying he's a quarterback whisperer or whatnot. Didn't he help develop Russell Wilson? All-pro.
Yeah.
Pro Bowler. He helped develop Geno. Geno's been here, 3 or 4 years now? Pro Bowl. So when you hear them talk about Drew Lock, they're saying, look, we're going to take the same approach that we did with Geno. Now, with Russell Wilson, you were allowed to develop him on the job because you had such a great defense, and he was allowed to make these mistakes. So whereas with these other two guys, they got to sit a little bit and show Pete Carroll that they understand what the assignment is and that they can execute that. So I wouldn't be surprised if Drew Lock comes back a better quarterback. How much better? Who knows?
Right.
You got to go out there and you got to play. But I am confident in saying that the next time you see Drew Lock on a football field, he will be a better quarterback for spending time here in Seattle because they've shown that that's what they do. And Pete Carroll plays a big part of that. It might not even be X's and O's. It might be the thought process, calming yourself down, understanding the situation. I mean, we look at that one deal when Geno Smith was getting hot in L.A. against the Chargers, and Pete Carroll just walks over to him and says, man, calm down. Boom, we talked about this. Get back into your center, your zen. Those are the things that Pete Carroll brings to the table, and then he does a good job of hiring guys to help develop them.